Some moments arrive without warning, carrying the power to reshape entire lives in a single heartbeat. For Marcus Whitfield, a man whose name commanded respect in boardrooms across 3 continents, such a moment would unfold in the most unlikely of places. A cramped diner on the wrong side of town where the coffee was bitter and the dream seemed broken. He was there by accident, seeking shelter from a sudden downpour that had caught his driver off guard. She was there by necessity, working her 3rd consecutive double shift to keep her world from completely falling apart. Neither expected their paths to cross, and certainly neither anticipated that a simple conversation would ignite a chain of events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about power, privilege, and the extraordinary strength found in ordinary people. The neon sign of Murphy's Diner flickered erratically against the stormy October sky, casting intermittent shadows across the rain-soaked pavement. Inside, the familiar symphony of clinking plates and muffled conversations provided a stark contrast to the chaos of the weather outside. It was well past midnight, and the usual crowd had thinned to a handful of night shift workers and insomniacs seeking refuge in caffeine and comfort food. Marcus Whitfield pushed through the glass door, his $1,000 suit immediately out of place among the worn vinyl booths and faded linoleum floors. Water dripped from his Italian leather shoes as he surveyed the modest establishment with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to evaluating investments. This was decidedly not his usual environment. The Whitfield empire had been built on luxury hotels, exclusive restaurants, and high-end real estate developments. Places like Murphy's Diner existed in a world he rarely acknowledged, let alone entered. His presence caused a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Conversations lowered to whispers, and curious glances followed his every movement. Marcus, positioning himself where he could observe the room, chose a corner booth, while remaining relatively inconspicuous. He pulled out his phone, intending to call his driver, but the device showed no signal. The storm had apparently knocked out several cell towers in the area. A young woman approached his table with practiced efficiency, her uniform crisp despite the obvious signs of a long shift. Her name tag read Sarah, and her smile, though tired, held genuine warmth. She couldn't have been more than 25, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and eyes that seemed to carry more weight than someone her age should bear. "Good evening, sir. I'm sorry about the weather keeping you out so late. Can I start you with some coffee while you decide what you'd like?" Marcus looked up from his phone, momentarily struck by the sincerity in her voice. In his world, service came with an underlying expectation of generous compensation. Here, kindness seemed to flow naturally, without calculation or hidden agenda. "Coffee would be fine, Black. And perhaps you could tell me if there's a phone I could use. My cell seems to be having issues." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "The storm knocked out most of the towers around here. Our landline is still working, though. You're welcome to use it once I get your coffee." As she moved away to fetch his order, Marcus found himself observing her interactions with other customers. She refilled cups without being asked, remembered personal details from previous conversations, and treated each person with the same respectful attention she had shown him. There was an authenticity to her demeanour that felt foreign in his experience. When Sarah returned with his coffee, she set it down carefully and glanced toward the phone behind the counter. "The phone's right over there whenever you need it. No rush at all." "Thank you." Marcus paused, studying her face. "You seem to enjoy what you do." Sarah's laugh was soft, but carried a note of something deeper. "I suppose I do. It's not glamorous work, but people need a place where they feel welcome, especially at this hour. Most folks who come in here are dealing with something difficult. Night shift workers, missing their families, people who can't sleep because of worry, travellers stranded by weather like yourself. Sometimes a warm cup of coffee and a friendly word can make all the difference." Her response intrigued him. "That's a remarkably philosophical approach to waitressing." "Maybe so." Sarah wiped down the already clean table, her movements economical and practiced. "My grandmother used to say that every job is really about serving others, whether you're flipping burgers or running a corporation. The only difference is the size of your kitchen." Marcus felt something shift inside him, a crack in the armour of cynicism that had protected him through decades of cutthroat business dealings. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She was." Sarah's expression grew distant for a moment. She raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12, worked 3 jobs to make sure I could go to college. I was supposed to be a teacher, had the degree and everything, but life had other plans. She gestured toward the diner with a sweep of her arm. Grandma got sick during my final semester. Cancer. The treatments ate through her savings faster than we could earn money. I dropped out to take care of her and started working here to pay the medical bills. She passed away 2 years ago, but I'm still paying off the debt. The casual way she shared this devastating information stunned Marcus. In his world, personal struggles were carefully hidden behind polished facades. Vulnerability was weakness, and weakness was exploited without mercy. Yet here was this young woman openly discussing her hardships with a complete stranger, finding meaning in circumstances that would have crushed many people. "I'm sorry for your loss." The words felt inadequate, but they were genuine. "Thank you." Sarah's smile returned, though tinged with sadness. She always said that the measure of a person isn't what happens to them, but how they choose to respond. I try to honour that by making this place a little brighter for whoever walks through that door. A crash of thunder outside punctuated her words, and the lights flickered momentarily. Sarah glanced toward the windows where rain continued to sheet down in torrents. "Looks like you might be here for a while. This storm isn't supposed to let up until morning. Can I get you something to eat?" The pie is homemade, and Frank makes a mean grilled cheese. Marcus realised he hadn't eaten since lunch, his appetite suppressed by back-to-back meetings and the stress of a particularly complex merger negotiation. The grilled cheese sounds perfect. As Sarah moved away to place his order, Marcus found himself studying the other patrons with new eyes. The elderly man in the corner booth wasn't just a lonely insomniac, he was someone's father, perhaps widowed and unable to sleep in an empty house. The young couple sharing a plate of fries weren't just late-night diners, they were probably struggling financially, stretching their money to afford even this modest meal. The woman at the counter staring into her coffee wasn't just tired, she was likely facing some crisis that kept sleep at bay. Each person carried their own story, their own struggles and triumphs. For the first time in years, Marcus felt the weight of his own isolation. His penthouse apartment, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and million-dollar view, suddenly seemed less like a sanctuary and more like a prison of his own making. Sarah returned with his sandwich, the golden bread perfectly toasted and the cheese melted to perfection. She also brought a small bowl of tomato soup without being asked. On the house, figured you might need some extra warmth on a night like this. Marcus took a bite of the sandwich, surprised by how satisfying such simple food could be. "This is excellent. Thank you for the soup." "My pleasure." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then slid into the seat across from him. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but you seem like you might have had a rough day yourself. Sometimes it helps to talk about it." The observation caught him off guard. In boardrooms and country clubs, people rarely looked beyond his success to see the person underneath. They saw the wealth, the power, the influence, but never the cost of maintaining such a facade. "What makes you say that?" Sarah tilted her head thoughtfully. "You've got the look of someone carrying heavy thoughts. Plus, nobody ends up in a place like this at this hour unless something's driven them here. Whether it's the storm outside or the storm inside, we all need shelter sometimes." Her insight was unsettling in its accuracy. Marcus had left his office that evening feeling the familiar emptiness that success had failed to fill. The merger he'd been orchestrating would add another $100 million to his portfolio, but it would also result in hundreds of job losses. The human cost of his decisions had been weighing on him more heavily lately, though he'd never admitted it to anyone. "You're very perceptive. Comes with the territory. You listen to enough people's stories, you start recognizing the patterns. Everyone's fighting some kind of battle, whether they show it or not." Marcus found himself wanting to share something real with this stranger, something beyond the carefully constructed persona he presented to the world. The impulse was both foreign and compelling. "I made a decision today that will change many lives, and not necessarily for the better. It's the right choice financially, but I can't shake the feeling that I've lost sight of something important along the way. Sarah nodded without judgment. Grandma used to say that the hardest decisions are the ones where doing right by the numbers means doing wrong by the heart. But she also said that recognizing that conflict is the first step toward finding a better way. And if there is no better way, if the choice is between financial survival and human cost, then maybe the question isn't about the choice itself, but about who gets to make it and why. Sarah's eyes held a wisdom that seemed beyond her years. Sometimes the people with the power to decide are the ones furthest from the consequences. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the door chime. A young man entered, shaking water from his jacket. Sarah immediately rose to greet him, her professional warmth returning. "Tommy, you're working late tonight." The usual. As Sarah attended to the new customer, Marcus reflected on their exchange. This waitress, struggling to pay off medical debt while working multiple jobs, possessed an emotional intelligence that most of his board members lacked. She had identified the core of his moral dilemma with startling clarity and offered a perspective he hadn't considered. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, but Marcus no longer felt trapped by the circumstances that had brought him here. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he was exactly where he needed to be. When Sarah returned to his table, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to find strength in service rather than shame. Marcus had been watching the easy way she interacted with the late-night regulars, how she remembered that Tommy liked extra pickles on his burger, and that the elderly gentleman preferred his coffee reheated rather than fresh. "Sorry about that. Thursday nights can get busy with the hospital shift change. How's your sandwich?" "Better than anything I've had in months." Marcus surprised himself with the honesty of the statement. "Tell me something. You mentioned you were studying to be a teacher. Do you ever regret not finishing?" Sarah settled back into the booth, her expression thoughtful. "Some days, yes. I had this dream of teaching 5th grade, you know? That age where kids are still curious about everything but old enough to really think. I wanted to be the teacher who made learning feel like an adventure." She traced patterns on the table with her finger. "But regret is a luxury I can't afford. When Grandma got sick, there wasn't time for what-ifs. There was only what needed to be done." That's a remarkable way to look at it. Is it? Seems pretty ordinary to me. People do what they have to do. The extraordinary part is when they have choices and still choose to do the right thing. The comment hung in the air between them, and Marcus felt its weight. He thought about the hundreds of employees who would lose their jobs because of his decision, people who had no choice in the matter, no voice in the boardroom where their fates were decided. Meanwhile, he had every choice available to him and had selected the path that maximized profit while minimizing his personal risk. What if someone had the power to help but wasn't sure how? What if the system itself seemed designed to prevent good choices? Sarah leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest. Then, maybe that someone needs to stop working within a broken system and start building a better one. My grandmother used to clean offices downtown, big corporate buildings. She'd come home with stories about the waste she'd see. Perfectly good furniture thrown away because it was last year's style. Food from executive meetings dumped in the trash while people went hungry outside. She always said the problem wasn't that people were bad, it was that the system made it easier to be wasteful than generous. Marcus felt a stirring of something he hadn't experienced in years. Not guilt, which was familiar and easily dismissed, but genuine inspiration. This young woman, with her mountain of debt and her overnight shifts, had identified the very problem that had been gnawing at his conscience for months. Your grandmother sounds like she understood business better than most CEOs. She understood people, which is really what business should be about, right? Serving people, meeting their needs, making their lives better somehow. Sarah glanced around the diner. Even this place, humble as it is, serves a purpose. We're open all night because people work all hours, because sometimes someone needs a warm meal and a friendly face when the rest of the world is asleep. The simplicity of her worldview was both humbling and illuminating. Marcus had spent decades complicating every decision with layers of analysis and risk assessment. But perhaps the most important questions were actually the simplest ones. Who benefits? Who gets hurt? How can we do better? What would you do if you suddenly had unlimited resources? If you could solve any problem, help anyone, change anything? Sarah laughed, a sound that was both delighted and slightly overwhelmed. That's quite a hypothetical. I suppose I'd start with education. Not just schools, but real learning opportunities for people who never got the chance or who had to give it up like I did. And healthcare. Nobody should have to choose between saving their grandmother and finishing college. She paused, her expression growing more serious. But mostly, I think I'd try to create more places like this. Like this diner. Like this feeling. Places where people matter more than profit margins, where everyone gets treated with dignity regardless of how much money they have in their pocket. Where the measure of success isn't just what you accumulate, but what you contribute. Marcus found himself imagining such a place, such a way of doing business. What would his empire look like if it operated on those principles? What if instead of maximizing shareholder value, he focused on maximizing human value? The concept was radical, almost unthinkable in his industry, yet it felt more logical than anything he'd considered in years. The door chimed again, admitting a woman with 2 young children. They were clearly struggling, the mother counting coins before approaching the counter while the children pressed their faces against the cold window, watching the storm. Sarah noticed immediately and excused herself from the table. Marcus watched as she approached the family, speaking quietly with the mother. Whatever she said caused the woman's shoulders to relax visibly. Sarah led them to a booth and brought colouring books and crayons for the children, then returned with steaming bowls of soup and sandwiches. When the mother tried to pay, Sarah waved away the money with a gentle smile. "Family special," Marcus heard her say. "No charge on storm nights." She returned to Marcus's table, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. Where were we? "You were revolutionising capitalism," Marcus said, his tone light but his interest genuine. "I'm curious about something. You just gave away food to that family. How does the owner feel about that kind of generosity?" Sarah's smile was mischievous. "Well, Frank, who owns this place, has been known to develop sudden cases of temporary blindness when it comes to families in need. He figures the cost of a few meals is nothing compared to the cost of letting people go hungry. Says it's good for business in the long run because kindness has a way of coming back around." And does it come back around? More often than you'd think. That woman with the kids. She's a nurse at the children's hospital. Last year when Frank's grandson was in the emergency room, she stayed past her shift to make sure he got the best care. Tommy over there, the one with the usual order. He's studying automotive repair. He's fixed Frank's delivery truck at least a dozen times, never charges full price. Mrs. Chen, who comes in every Tuesday for pie and coffee, brings homemade dumplings for the whole staff every Christmas. Marcus was beginning to understand something profound about the economy of kindness that operated in this small diner. It was a closed loop of mutual support where generosity created loyalty, loyalty created community, and community created resilience. It was everything his corporate training had taught him was impossible, yet he was witnessing it firsthand. "You've built something remarkable here. We've all built it together." That's the thing about community. It's not something one person creates. It's something that grows when people decide to care about each other's success as much as their own. The storm outside was beginning to weaken, the thunder growing more distant and the rain settling into a steady rhythm rather than the earlier torrent. Marcus realised that his phone probably had service again, that his driver could navigate the streets, that he could return to his familiar world of leather seats and climate-controlled isolation. Yet he felt no urgency to leave. "Sarah, can I ask you something that might sound strange?" "After the night we've had, I doubt anything could sound strange. If someone offered you a chance to go back to school, to finish your degree and become that teacher you dreamed of being, would you take it?" Her eyes widened with surprise and something that looked like carefully guarded hope. "That's not really a realistic question. The debt alone would take years to pay off, and then there's living expenses while in school, student loans, the opportunity cost of not working. But hypothetically, If those obstacles were removed, would teaching still be your dream? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could see the internal struggle playing out across her features. Hope warring with pragmatism, dreams fighting against the hard lessons of experience. "Yes," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every day I watch people come in here carrying burdens they shouldn't have to bear alone. Every night I go home thinking about all the kids who won't get the education they deserve, because teachers like me had to make other choices. So, yes, if it were possible, if it were really possible, teaching would still be my dream." Marcus felt something click into place, a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for longer than he cared to admit. The merger he'd been orchestrating, the decision that had been weighing so heavily on his conscience, suddenly seemed like a small problem with an obvious solution. Not the only solution, perhaps, but definitely the right one. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the gentle patter of rain against the windows and the distant hum of the coffee machine. Marcus found himself at a crossroads that had nothing to do with weather or circumstance, and everything to do with the fundamental direction of his life. This conversation with Sarah had illuminated something that months of therapy and executive coaching had failed to reveal. The emptiness he'd been feeling wasn't about success or failure. It was about meaning. "Sarah, what I'm about to tell you might sound impossible, but I need you to hear me out." Marcus leaned forward, his voice carrying an intensity that made her look up sharply. "My name is Marcus Whitfield. I own Whitfield Enterprises." Recognition flickered across her features. Even someone working multiple jobs to survive knew that name. Whitfield Enterprises owned hotels, restaurants, and real estate developments across the country. Their logo was visible from the highway on at least a dozen buildings in this city alone. I know this is going to sound like some kind of elaborate joke or maybe a test, but it's not. I came in here tonight because my driver got caught in the storm and I needed shelter. I expected to make a phone call and leave. Instead, I've had the most meaningful conversation I've had in years with someone who sees the world more clearly than anyone in my boardroom. Sarah's expression shifted from surprise to wariness. "Sir, I appreciate the compliment, but I'm not sure where this is going." "It's going toward an opportunity that could change both of our lives." Marcus pulled out his wallet and removed a business card, placing it carefully on the table between them. "That merger I mentioned, the decision that was weighing on me, it involves acquiring a chain of struggling community colleges. My board wants to close half of them and convert the others into luxury condominiums. The profit margin would be substantial." Sarah's face paled as she began to understand the implications. How many students would lose their schools? Approximately 15,000 across 12 campuses. Most of them are exactly like you were, working adults trying to better themselves despite difficult circumstances. Marcus watched her absorb this information, seeing the same moral calculation he'd been wrestling with play out in her eyes. "The board meeting is tomorrow morning. The vote is expected to be unanimous. But you're having second thoughts." "I'm having a complete change of perspective." Marcus reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers. "What if instead of closing those schools, we transform them into something unprecedented? What if we created institutions that not only provided education but supported students through the barriers that force people like you to drop out? Childcare, healthcare, financial assistance, job placement, community support systems?" Sarah stared at him, her mind clearly racing. "That would cost millions." "It would cost approximately the same amount as the luxury condominiums, but the return on investment would be measured in lives changed rather than units sold." Marcus felt the excitement building in his voice. And it would need leadership from someone who understands what these students face, someone who's lived their challenges and still believes in the power of education to transform lives. The implication hung in the air between them. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. "Are you offering me a job, Mr. Whitfield?" I'm offering you a chance to become the president of the Whitfield Community Education Initiative. Full tuition for you to complete your degree while you develop and oversee a program that could serve as a model for educational institutions nationwide. Marcus felt a clarity of purpose he hadn't experienced in decades. Your salary would be enough to clear your grandmother's medical debt within the first year, and the position would come with comprehensive healthcare benefits and housing assistance. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back quickly. Years of hardship had taught her to be suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true. Why me? You don't know anything about my qualifications, my experience, my ability to handle something that complex. You're right, I don't know your resume or your test scores or your professional references. Marcus leaned back, his expression earnest. But I know you've managed to maintain your compassion while facing circumstances that would embitter most people. I know you understand the difference between serving customers and serving community. I know you can identify systemic problems and envision practical solutions. And most importantly, I know you care more about doing the right thing than about doing the profitable thing. The diner had grown quieter as the night wore on. The family with children had finished their meal and departed with grateful smiles and waves. Tommy had taken his burger to go, heading back to whatever late-shift job kept him working until dawn. The elderly gentleman remained at his corner table, but even he seemed to be listening to their conversation with polite interest. "This is overwhelming." Sarah's voice was barely audible. 6 hours ago, I was worried about making rent next month. Now you're talking about changing my entire life. I understand that feeling. 6 hours ago, I was planning to displace 15,000 students to increase my profit margins. Now I'm talking about fundamentally changing how my company operates. Marcus smiled, and for the first time in months, the expression felt genuine. Sometimes the most important decisions we make are the ones that surprise us. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, her gaze alternating between Marcus's face and the business card on the table. Finally, she spoke. What would happen to the people who work here? To Frank? To this place? This job might not be glamorous, but it matters to the community. I can't just abandon that. Her concern for others, even in the face of a life-changing opportunity, confirmed everything Marcus had intuited about her character. The Whitfield Initiative would need community partnerships, local businesses that understand the challenges facing adult learners, places where students could work flexible schedules while attending classes. Murphy's Diner would be perfect as a pilot program for our work-study initiatives. You'd partner with Frank. We'd provide funding for him to expand his staff and offer guaranteed part-time positions to students in our programs. He'd get reliable employees who understand the value of hard work, and our students would get jobs with employers who understand their educational commitments. Marcus could see the pieces falling into place, the vision becoming more concrete with each detail. Your experience here wouldn't be wasted. It would be foundational to everything we build. Sarah picked up the business card, turning it over in her hands. When would you need an answer? The board meeting is at 9 tomorrow morning. If I'm going to propose this alternative to the condo development, I need to know I have the right person to lead it. Marcus glanced at his watch, surprised to see it was already 3 in the morning. Sarah met his eyes directly as before, speaking. I don't know whether this is really about helping people or about easing your conscience, because if you're looking for a way to feel better about your other business decisions, there are easier ways to do that. Charity donations, scholarship funds, volunteer work. But if you're serious about fundamentally changing how you operate, about building something that puts people before profits consistently, then I'm interested. You're right to question my motives. I've spent 20 years building wealth by making decisions that prioritize financial returns over human impact. I've told myself that creating jobs and generating tax revenue was contribution enough, but tonight has made me realize how hollow that justification really is. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I can't undo the decisions I've made, but I can change the framework for every decision going forward. This isn't about charity or conscience salving. It's about building a business model that proves profitability and social responsibility aren't mutually exclusive. Sarah nodded slowly. And if the board doesn't approve your proposal, then I'll find another way to make it happen. Even if it means using my personal assets instead of corporate resources, even if it means starting smaller than I'd hoped. Marcus felt the truth of those words as he spoke them. This conversation has changed something fundamental in how I see my role in the world. There's no going back to the old way of operating. The sincerity in his voice seemed to convince her. Sarah tucked the business card into her apron pocket and extended her hand across the table. Mr. Whitfield, if you're serious about this, if you're really committed to building something that serves people rather than exploiting them, then yes, I accept your offer. Marcus shook her hand, feeling the calluses from years of hard work and the strength that came from overcoming obstacles that would have defeated lesser people. Call me Marcus, and thank you, Sarah. I have a feeling you're going to teach me as much as I hope to teach others. The storm outside had finally passed, leaving the streets washed clean and glistening under the streetlights. Through the diner windows, Marcus could see his driver's car pulling up to the curb, the headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. His urgent communications about that had been delayed by the weather phone buzzed with messages, stock prices and meeting preparations, and all the minutiae of running a corporate empire. But for the first time in years, those messages felt secondary to something more important. He had found not just a solution to his moral dilemma, but a partner in building something entirely new. The merger meeting in a few hours would be unlike any board presentation he'd ever given, and the outcome would determine not just the fate of 12 community colleges, but the direction of his entire company. I should let you get back to work. Marcus stood, leaving enough money on the table to cover his modest meal several times over. I'll have my assistant contact you tomorrow with the details we discussed. We'll need to move quickly if this is going to happen. I'll be ready. Sarah walked him to the door, her professional demeanour returning, but tempered now with something that looked like excitement. Marcus? Thank you for seeing something in me that I wasn't sure was still there. Thank you for reminding me what business should really be about. As Marcus stepped out into the cool, clean air of the post-storm morning, he felt lighter than he had in months. The weight of moral compromise that had been pressing down on him was replaced by the energizing challenge of building something meaningful. He had entered Murphy's Diner as a man trapped by the limitations of conventional success. He was leaving as someone with the opportunity to redefine what success could mean. The drive back to his penthouse passed in a blur of preparation and planning. By the time his driver pulled up to the gleaming tower that housed both his corporate offices and his private residence, Marcus had outlined the presentation that would either transform his company or force him to start over entirely. Either outcome felt preferable to continuing down the path that had brought him to that diner in the first place. As he rode the elevator to the 80th floor, Marcus thought about the conversation that awaited him with his board of directors. These were people who had trusted him to maximize their investments, who expected him to make decisions based on proven financial models rather than philosophical ideals. Convincing them to embrace a radically different approach would require more than just moral arguments. He would need to demonstrate that doing good and doing well weren't incompatible goals. The challenge energized him in a way that closing deals and acquiring assets no longer did. For the first time in his career, Marcus felt like he was building towards something larger than personal wealth or corporate dominance. He was building toward a legacy that would matter to people like Sarah, people whose dreams had been deferred by circumstances beyond their control, but whose potential remained unlimited. The sun was beginning to rise over the city as Marcus reached his apartment, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded him of hope and new beginnings. In a few hours, he would stand before his board and propose a future that prioritized the human development over real estate development. The outcome was uncertain, but his commitment was absolute. He had found his answer in the most unlikely place, delivered by someone the business world would dismiss as insignificant. But Sarah had proven that wisdom and insight weren't distributed according to wealth or status. They belong to anyone willing to see beyond their own circumstances to the broader human experience. The merger meeting would determine whether Marcus could transform his vision into reality within the existing corporate structure. But regardless of that outcome, his conversation with Sarah had already transformed something more fundamental. It had restored his sense of purpose and reminded him that the most important measures of success couldn't be quantified in quarterly reports. As he prepared for what might be the most consequential presentation of his career, Marcus smiled at the thought of Sarah starting her shift at Murphy's Diner in just a few hours, unaware that she had single-handedly changed the trajectory of a billion-dollar enterprise. By evening, if everything went according to plan, her life would be as transformed as his own. The waitress who had served him coffee and wisdom in equal measure was about to become his partner in proving that business could be a force for human flourishing rather than merely a mechanism for wealth accumulation. The boardroom on the 80th floor of the Whitfield Tower had hosted countless meetings that shaped the economic landscape of the city, but none quite like the one about to unfold. As Marcus entered the glass-walled conference room, he found his 8 board members already assembled around the mahogany table, their faces bearing the confident expressions of people anticipating another profitable quarter. Coffee steamed from bone china cups, and the morning financial reports were spread before each seat like battle plans. Margaret Thornfield, the board's senior member and Marcus's most trusted advisor for over a decade, looked up from her tablet with a slight frown. "Marcus, you look different this morning. The storm didn't cause any problems, I hope." "On the contrary, Margaret, the storm provided exactly what I needed." Marcus took his place at the head of the table, his usual stack of presentation materials notably absent. "Before we discuss the Meridian College acquisition, I need to share something that happened last night." The board members exchanged glances. Marcus was known for his meticulous preparation and data-driven presentations. This informal beginning was distinctly out of character. Robert Ashworth, the youngest member of the board and a fierce advocate for aggressive expansion, leaned forward impatiently. "Marcus, we've run the numbers on this deal a dozen times. The conversion to luxury condos will yield a 38% return on investment within 2 years. What more is there to discuss?" "The human cost," Marcus replied simply. "Last night I had a conversation that forced me to confront something I've been avoiding. We're not just acquiring buildings and land, we're displacing 15,000 students who are fighting for better lives." An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. These were people accustomed to discussing market penetration and profit margins, not the personal struggles of community college students. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the board's education sector specialist, cleared her throat diplomatically. "Marcus, I understand your concern for the affected students, but we've established that most of these institutions are financially unsustainable. We're actually preventing a more chaotic closure that would happen inevitably. Are we? Or are we simply choosing the most profitable form of closure?" Marcus stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. Somewhere down there, Sarah was probably serving breakfast to the early shift workers at Murphy's Diner, unaware that her future hung in the balance of this conversation. "I want to propose an alternative that addresses both our financial objectives and our social responsibilities." Margaret's expression sharpened with interest. Despite her reputation for fiscal conservatism, she had always respected Marcus's innovative thinking. "What kind of alternative?" Marcus turned back to face the group, his voice gaining strength as he outlined the vision that had crystallized during his sleepless night. "Instead of converting these campuses to residential properties, we transform them into a revolutionary educational model. We create institutions that don't just provide classes, but address every barrier that prevents working adults from completing their education." The presentation that followed was unlike anything Marcus had ever delivered. Instead of charts showing projected profits and market analysis, he painted a picture of comprehensive support systems. On-site childcare for student parents, healthcare clinics staffed by nursing students from partner universities, financial counselling and emergency assistance funds, job placement programs with local businesses willing to offer flexible schedules for students. The initial investment would be comparable to the condominium development. Marcus explained, his enthusiasm building as he described each component. But the return wouldn't be measured solely in financial terms. We'd be creating a replicable model that could transform adult education nationwide. Thomas Blackwood, the board's most conservative member, shook his head slowly. Marcus, this sounds like social work, not business. Our fiduciary responsibility is to our shareholders, not to struggling students. What if I told you that struggling students could become our most valuable shareholders? Marcus had anticipated this objection. Every person we help complete their education becomes a higher earner, a more productive citizen, a potential customer for our other enterprises. We're not just investing in buildings, we're investing in human capital that will generate returns for decades. Robert's skepticism was evident in his voice. That's a very long-term perspective on return on investment. Our shareholders expect quarterly growth, not generational social impact. Then perhaps it's time we educated our shareholders about the value of sustainable growth versus short-term extraction. Marcus's tone carried a quiet authority that silenced the room. The old model of business, the one that prioritizes immediate profits over long-term consequences, is becoming obsolete. Companies that fail to adapt will find themselves irrelevant. Margaret studied his face carefully. You're serious about this, aren't you? This isn't just a momentary crisis of conscience. It's a fundamental shift in how I understand our role in society. Marcus returned to his seat, leaning forward to address each board member directly. Last night I met someone who showed me that business at its best is about creating opportunities for human flourishing, not just for those who already have advantages, but especially for those who don't. Dr. Chen looked intrigued despite her initial reservations. You mentioned this conversation changed your perspective. May I ask who you spoke with? A waitress named Sarah who dropped out of college to care for her dying grandmother and is still paying off the medical debt 2 years later. She works overnight shifts at a diner, but she has more insight into education and community building than most policy experts I've consulted. Marcus paused, allowing the weight of that statement to settle. She's also the person I want to lead this initiative. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Robert laughed outright while Thomas looked genuinely shocked. Margaret's expression remained neutral, but her raised eyebrow indicated deep skepticism. Marcus, Robert said, still chuckling, you want to put a waitress in charge of a multi-million-dollar educational program. This is starting to sound like a fairy tale rather than a business proposal. Is it? Marcus's voice carried a steel edge that silenced Robert's amusement. Sarah understands the challenges our target population faces because she's lived them. She knows what support systems would actually help because she's experienced their absence. She has the empathy to design programs that serve students rather than bureaucratic convenience. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her analytical mind clearly working through the implications. What about her qualifications? Educational background, management experience. She was 3 credits away from a teaching degree when family circumstances forced her to leave school. She's managed complex situations with limited resources for years, and she's demonstrated leadership qualities in building community within her workplace. Marcus felt his conviction growing stronger as he defended his choice. Most importantly, she shares the vision of what these institutions could become. Thomas shook his head firmly. This is precisely the kind of sentimental decision-making that destroys companies. You're letting emotion override sound business judgment. Am I? Or am I recognizing that the most successful businesses are built on understanding and serving human needs? Marcus challenged. Every transformational company in history succeeded because they saw something others missed. They didn't follow conventional wisdom. They created new paradigms. Dr. Chen spoke thoughtfully. I'll admit there's precedent for unconventional leadership choices yielding remarkable results. Some of our most innovative educational programs have been developed by people with non-traditional backgrounds. The debate continued for another hour, with Marcus fielding questions about funding structures, regulatory compliance, and implementation timelines. Gradually, he could see the shift in the room's dynamic. Margaret's skepticism was evolving into cautious interest. Dr. Chen was taking notes and asking increasingly detailed questions about curriculum design. Even Thomas seemed less dismissive, though he remained concerned about financial projections. Robert, however, remained adamantly opposed. This is a massive risk with uncertain returns. We have a guaranteed profitable deal on the table, and you want to abandon it for an experimental program led by someone with no relevant experience. The relevant experience is understanding what doesn't work and why, Marcus countered. Sarah has seen the failures of the current system from the inside. She knows where the gaps are because through them. Margaret, she's fallen, finally spoke, her voice carrying the authority of her position as senior board member. Marcus, I've known you for 15 years. I've watched you build this company through calculated risks and innovative thinking. This proposal is certainly unconventional, but it's not without merit. She paused, looking around the table. However, if we're going to proceed with something this radical, we need safeguards. Performance metrics, oversight structures, contingency plans. Absolutely, Marcus agreed. This isn't about abandoning business discipline. It's about applying that discipline to a different set of objectives. The next 2 hours were spent hammering out the framework for what would become known as the Whitfield Community Education Initiative. The program would launch with 3 pilot campuses, allowing for careful monitoring and adjustment before full-scale implementation. Sarah would work alongside experienced administrators while completing her own degree, creating a leadership development model that could be replicated as the program expanded. Financial projections were conservative but promising. The initiative would break even within 5 years, with potential for significant returns as graduates entered higher-paying careers and became donors to support future students. More importantly, the program would generate invaluable data about effective adult education models, creating intellectual property that could be licensed to other institutions. By noon, 6 of the 8 board members had voted to approve the alternative proposal. Robert remained opposed, arguing that the company was abandoning its core mission. Thomas abstained, expressing hope that Marcus's vision would succeed while maintaining reservations about the risks involved. As the board members filed out of the conference room discussing implementation details and timeline concerns, Marcus felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Not the hollow satisfaction of closing another profitable deal, but the deep fulfillment of aligning his actions with his values. Margaret lingered behind, studying his face with the shrewd assessment of someone who had watched him navigate countless business challenges. You realize this changes everything, don't you? Not just this deal, but how we approach every future decision. You're establishing a precedent that will affect every acquisition, every development project, every strategic initiative. I hope so, Marcus replied without hesitation. The old way of operating was making us wealthy, but leaving us empty. This feels like the beginning of building something that will matter, long after the quarterly reports are forgotten. And if it fails, if the program doesn't achieve the projected outcomes, if Sarah proves unable to handle the responsibilities, if our shareholders revolt against the reduced profits, Margaret's questions weren't challenges, but the careful considerations of someone planning for contingencies. Then we'll have failed attempting something worthwhile rather than succeeding at something hollow. Marcus gathered the notes and proposals scattered across the conference table. But I don't think it will fail. I think we're going to discover that doing good and doing well aren't mutually exclusive goals. As Marcus walked through the glass doors of Murphy's Diner that evening, the familiar chime announced his arrival to a world that looked exactly the same, but felt completely different. Sarah glanced up from wiping down tables, her eyes widening with a mixture of surprise and nervous anticipation. The conversation that followed would seal their partnership and launch an educational revolution that would transform thousands of lives across the country. Within 6 months, the first Whitfield Community Education Initiative campus opened its doors to students who had given up hope of ever finishing their degrees. Sarah, now balancing her own accelerated coursework with her role as program director, proved that unconventional leadership could yield extraordinary results. The waiting lists grew longer each semester, and other cities began requesting their own campuses. This story reminds us that the most profound changes often begin with the simplest human connections. Sometimes it takes a stranger's wisdom to show us who we're meant to become, and sometimes the most important business decisions happen not in boardrooms, but in the quiet moments when we finally listen to our conscience. If this story of unexpected transformation moved you, please share it with someone who believes in the power of second chances, and subscribe for more inspiring tales of how ordinary encounters can create extraordinary change.